The unlikely encounter. James Marshall stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with a sense of anticipation. Today was his rare day off, a chance to escape the demands of his role as a police officer in Detroit and indulge in a simple pleasure, a meal out. He smoothed down the crisp white shirt that contrasted sharply against his dark skin, a representation of his pride and the years he had dedicated to serving his community. At 42, James carried his experiences like a well-fitted suit, each wrinkle a testament to the stories he had lived through. As he stepped out of his modest apartment, the spring air greeted him with a refreshing promise. The sun peeked through the gaps between the buildings, casting long shadows on the bustling streets of Detroit. He walked with purpose, shoulders back and head held high, embodying the dignity that came from years of service. James enjoyed the rhythm of the city, the sounds of laughter, the chatter of passersby, and the distant hum of life unfolding all around him. After a short walk, James arrived at Hank's Diner, a local eatery he had been meaning to try. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and he was welcomed by the comforting aroma of coffee and bacon mingling with the soft chatter of the lunch crowd. He spotted an empty booth near the window and made his way over, nodding politely at the other patrons as he passed. A young waitress with blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail approached his table, her name tag reading Sarah. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get for you today?" Her smile was warm and genuine. "Afternoon. I'll have the house special and a coffee, please," James replied, returning her smile. Sarah jotted down his order, but just as she turned to leave, a gruff voice called out from behind the counter. "Sarah, get over here." James watched as she hurried over to a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a scowl etched deeply into his features. This was Hank, the owner of the diner. The tension between Hank and Sarah was palpable, and James's instincts as a cop kicked in. He observed the interaction closely. Hank's hushed tones and Sarah's nervous posture spoke volumes. After a brief exchange, Sarah returned to James's table, her eyes downcast. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're all out of the house special. Perhaps I could interest you in something else." James furrowed his brow, feeling a strange knot in his stomach. "All out? But I just saw someone else being served the same dish." Sarah's cheeks flushed as she opened her mouth to explain, but no words came out. Just then, Hank stormed over, his voice booming. "Is there a problem here?" James met Hank's glare with calm defiance. "No problem at all. I was just wondering why you're out of the house special when I can clearly see it being served to other customers." Hank's jaw clenched, and he looked around, noticing the growing attention from other diners. "Look, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." The diner fell silent. All eyes turned to James and Hank, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Standing slowly, James towered over Hank, his imposing figure exuding a quiet strength. "Are you refusing to serve me because I'm black?" Hank's face reddened. "Now, don't go playing the race card. This is my establishment, and I make the rules. Last I checked, discrimination based on race is against the law," James replied, his voice steady but firm. Before the situation escalated further, Sarah stepped between them, her voice shaking. "Please, let's not make a scene." James looked at her, feeling the weight of her concern. He was not just James Marshall in that moment. He was every person of color who had ever been marginalized or disrespected. "I think I've lost my appetite," he said, reaching for his wallet. He placed a $20 bill on the table for Sarah. "For your trouble." As he turned to leave, Hank grabbed his arm. "Now wait just a minute." In an instant, James reacted instinctively, twisting out of Hank's grip and pinning the man's arm behind his back in one fluid motion. The diner erupted in gasps and murmurs. "Don't touch me," James said, his voice low and dangerous. He released Hank and stepped back, hands raised. "I'm leaving, but this isn't over." Stepping outside, his heart pounded fiercely. He had faced danger on the streets countless times, but this felt different, personal, raw. As he reached the sidewalk, he heard quick footsteps behind him. Wait, it was Sarah, breathless from running after him. I'm so sorry about what happened in there. It's not right. James turned, surprised by her show of support. Thank you, Sarah, but you should get back inside before you lose your job. Sarah shook her head, determination blazing in her eyes. No, what Hank did was wrong. I can't keep working for someone like that. I want to help make this right. James studied her for a moment, feeling a mix of gratitude and concern. Okay, let's talk. As they walked away from the diner, neither noticed the figure watching them from across the street. Phone in hand, a sinister smile playing on their lips. Little did they know that their chance encounter at Hank's diner was about to set off a chain of events that would shake Detroit to its core, exposing deep-rooted corruption and challenging the very foundations of justice in the city. Are you sure about this? Standing up against your boss is no small thing, James asked, breaking the silence. Sarah's eyes met his unwaveringly. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. What happened in there isn't just about you or me. It's about what's right. James nodded, the gravity of their mission settling between them. So, where do we start? Before Sarah could respond, the sudden blaring of police sirens nearby cut through the air. Her eyes widened. That's not for us, is it? James shook his head, a rueful smile playing on his lips. No, but it's a reminder that this city never sleeps. Come on, I know a quiet place where we can talk. They rounded the corner, the sirens fading behind them, and James led Sarah to a small park nestled between two aging brick buildings. As they settled onto a bench, the city's rhythm seemed to slow, giving them a moment of peace to gather their thoughts. All right, James began, his voice low and steady. Tell me everything you know about Hank and how he runs that diner. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. Hank's always been difficult, but lately it's gotten worse. He's been turning away more customers, always with some flimsy excuse. It's not just black folks, Hispanics, Middle Easterners, anyone he deems undesirable. James leaned forward, concern etched on his face. Has anyone ever complained? A few times, Sarah nodded, but nothing ever comes of it. It's like the complaints disappear into thin air. As Sarah spoke, James's mind raced. Years of police work had prepared him for tough situations, but he never imagined he'd be sitting here, plotting a course of action against systemic injustice in a diner he had hoped would be a simple escape. The conversation shifted from one of discomfort to determination, setting the stage for what would unfold next. Confrontation at Hank's diner. James turned to face Hank, his posture unwavering. No problem at all. I was just inquiring why you're out of the house special when I can clearly see it being served to other customers. He maintained a calm demeanor, though a simmering anger threatened to break the surface. Hank's jaw clenched tightly, his irritation palpable. Look, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, he snapped, his eyes narrowing at James. The diner fell into an eerie silence. All eyes were now fixed on James and Hank, the tension thickening the air around them. James stood slowly, his towering figure casting a shadow over the smaller man. Are you refusing to serve me because I'm black? He asked, his voice steady but laced with an intensity that demanded respect. Hank's face reddened, his irritation morphing into indignation. Now don't go playing the race card. This is my establishment, and I make the rules, he replied, his voice rising. James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a meal. It was a direct challenge to his dignity. Last I checked, discrimination based on race is against the law, he stated, keeping his tone measured. Please, let's not make a scene, Sarah interjected, stepping between them, her voice shaking slightly. This isn't necessary. James glanced at her, recognizing her discomfort, But his resolve only hardened. "I think I've lost my appetite," he said, reaching for his wallet. He pulled out a $20 bill and placed it on the table for Sarah. "For your trouble," he added before turning to leave. As he turned away, Hank reached out and grabbed James's arm. "Now wait just a minute." James reacted instinctively. With a quick twist, he broke free from Hank's grip, effortlessly pinning the man's arm behind his back in one fluid motion. Gasps erupted from the other diners, a wave of murmurs crashing over the silence. "Don't touch me," James warned, his voice low and menacing. He released Hank and stepped back, hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression. "I'm leaving, but this isn't over." With a pounding heart, James walked out of the diner, feeling the eyes of the patrons on him, some filled with sympathy, others with judgment. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the spring air felt charged, each breath a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. He had faced danger many times in his career, but this felt different, personal, raw, a stark reminder of the societal issues that still festered beneath the surface. Suddenly, he heard quick footsteps behind him. Wait, it was Sarah, breathless from running after him. "I'm so sorry about what happened in there. It's not right." James turned, surprised by her unexpected support. "Thank you, Sarah, but you should get back inside before you lose your job," he said, concern lacing his voice. She shook her head vigorously, determination blazing in her blue eyes. "No, what Hank did was wrong. I can't keep working for someone like that. I want to help make this right." James studied her for a moment, admiring her courage. "Okay, let's talk," he agreed, sensing the weight of their shared purpose. They began walking away from the diner, oblivious to the figure watching them from across the street, phone in hand, a sinister smile playing on their lips. Unbeknownst to James and Sarah, their chance encounter at Hank's diner was about to set in motion a chain of events that would shake Detroit to its core, exposing deep-rooted corruption and challenging the very foundations of justice in the city. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, glancing sideways at Sarah as they walked. "Standing up against your boss is no small thing." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. What happened in there? It's not just about you or me. It's about what's right." As they made their way through the bustling streets of Detroit, the background noise of city life faded, leaving them in their own bubble of determination and purpose. "Where do we start?" James asked, breaking the silence. Just as Sarah was about to respond, the blaring of police sirens erupted nearby. "That's not for us, is it?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with concern. James chuckled, a relaxed smile breaking through his earlier tension. "No, but it's a reminder that this city never sleeps. Come on, I know a quiet place where we can talk." They rounded a corner, the sirens fading behind them as they approached a small park tucked between two aging brick buildings. It was a peaceful oasis amidst the urban chaos. As they settled onto a bench, the city's rhythm seemed to slow down, granting them a moment of serenity to gather their thoughts. "All right," James began, his voice low and steady. "Tell me everything you know about Hank and how he runs that diner." Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. "Hank's always been difficult, but lately it's gotten worse. He's been turning away more customers, always with some flimsy excuse. It's not just black folks, it's Hispanics, Middle Easterners, anyone he deems undesirable." James leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concern. "Has anyone ever complained?" "A few times," Sarah nodded, "but nothing ever comes of it. It's like the complaints disappear into thin air." As she spoke, James's mind raced. Years of police work had trained him to recognize patterns and uncover injustices, and it seemed Hank's diner was a perfect example of discrimination cloaked in the guise of business operations. "How long has this been going on?" James asked, his tone urgent. Sarah hesitated for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "I've been working there for about 3 years, But I've noticed a shift in the last year. Customers of color get treated differently. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's gotten worse since he inherited the diner from his father. It's as if he feels empowered to uphold some outdated tradition of exclusion." James nodded, his mind swirling with the implications of what she was saying. This wasn't just about a single diner. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a reflection of systemic issues ingrained in society. "We need to document everything," he said finally. "Gather evidence, testimonies, anything we can to build a case against him." Sarah's eyes lit up with newfound hope. "I can talk to some of the regular customers. I've seen how they've been treated. They'll want to share their stories. We can create a record of all the incidents." James smiled, feeling a sense of purpose swell within him. "Good idea. We can't let Hank's actions go unchecked. It's time to shine a light on this." As they discussed their plan, little did they know that their quest for justice would lead them down a path fraught with challenges, testing their resolve and forcing them to confront not only Hank's discrimination, but also the deep-rooted biases that permeated their community. They spent the next hour discussing strategies, their conversations flowing seamlessly, each idea sparking another. The camaraderie that developed between them felt refreshing, a bond forged in the fires of injustice, and a mutual desire to effect change. Eventually, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the park, they agreed to meet again the following day to start gathering testimonies. James walked Sarah back to her car, a sense of camaraderie and purpose enveloping them. "Thank you for standing up for what's right," James said as they reached her vehicle. "It takes courage, and I respect that." Sarah smiled, her cheeks flushing with pride. "Thank you for believing in me. Together, we can make a difference." As they parted ways, James felt a renewed sense of hope. They were just two individuals, but together, they were about to challenge the status quo and stand against discrimination in all its forms. Little did they know, the figure that had been watching them was already beginning to act, an unseen force that would complicate their efforts and challenge their resilience. The road ahead would not be easy, but James and Sarah were ready to face whatever came their way. Together, they were determined to unveil the truth hidden behind the walls of Hank's Diner, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been marginalized and silenced. Their journey had just begun. The gathering storm. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sunlight streaming through James's window and casting a warm glow across his living room. He awoke with a renewed sense of purpose, excitement bubbling within him at the prospect of working alongside Sarah to expose the discrimination at Hank's Diner. As he brewed a cup of coffee, he reflected on the previous day's events, the confrontation, the unexpected alliance with Sarah, and the challenge that lay ahead. He quickly dressed in his usual attire, comfortable jeans and a fitted polo shirt, and grabbed his notepad and pen. With everything prepared, he headed out to meet Sarah at a local cafe, where they planned to strategize their next steps. The streets of Detroit were alive with energy. The morning hustle and bustle infused the air with a sense of possibility. As James entered the cafe, he spotted Sarah at a table in a corner, her laptop open, and a determined look on her face. He approached her, and she looked up, her expression shifting from concentration to a bright smile. "Good morning, James. Ready to make some noise?" "More than ready," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I've been thinking about how we can gather testimonies. It's vital to document everything we can." Sarah nodded vigorously. "I've already reached out to a few customers who have experienced discrimination at Hank's. They're willing to share their stories. I was thinking we could start by recording their testimonies and then compiling the evidence into a report." "Great idea," James said, feeling a rush of enthusiasm. "We should also consider reaching out to local advocacy groups. They may have resources or connections that can help us amplify our message." As they began to outline their plan, a sense of camaraderie blossomed between them. They shared laughter and stories, discovering common interests beyond the pressing issue at hand. Sarah revealed her passion for social justice, describing how she had long been an advocate for marginalized communities, and James shared his own experiences as a police officer, emphasizing the challenges of fighting systemic bias from within the force. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted when the cafe door swung open, and a familiar face entered. It was Hank, the diner owner, his scowl unmistakable even from a distance. He paused as he spotted James and Sarah, a flash of irritation crossing his features before he continued toward the counter. James's heart raced. This was a critical moment. "Stay calm," he whispered to Sarah, but inside, his instincts screamed for caution. Hank had no reason to be there, and his appearance felt like a dark omen, a reminder that their mission was under scrutiny. Hank ordered his coffee and settled at a table not far from them, his eyes occasionally glancing over, assessing their conversation with suspicion. James tried to focus on the task at hand, but the atmosphere shifted, tension creeping in like a shadow. "Let's not let him derail us," he said, leaning closer to Sarah. "We need to stay focused on our plan." After some time, Hank finished his coffee and left, but the encounter left a lingering unease in the air. "We have to be careful," Sarah said, her voice low. "Hank seems to have a sixth sense about these things." James agreed, knowing that any misstep could jeopardize their efforts. "Let's proceed cautiously. We should start gathering testimonies today, but let's avoid drawing too much attention to ourselves." With their plan in place, they set out to visit the diner and begin their mission. The sun hung high in the sky as they approached Hank's diner once more. The familiar bell above the door chimed ominously as they stepped inside, the ambience a stark contrast to their hopeful intentions. James glanced around the room, noting the usual clientele, a mix of regulars and newcomers. He could feel Hank's watchful eyes on them, a hawk ready to swoop down at any moment. "Let's try to keep things low-key," he whispered to Sarah as they took a seat at a booth in the far corner. As they settled in, James noticed a familiar face among the patrons, an older black man named Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher who often frequented the diner. James had spoken with him several times during past visits, and he remembered Mr. Thompson's thoughtful insights on community issues. "I think he'll be a great person to start with," James said, pointing subtly to Mr. Thompson. "Let's go introduce ourselves," Sarah suggested, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. James nodded, and they approached Mr. Thompson's table. "Mr. Thompson, it's good to see you," James said warmly, extending his hand. "We wanted to ask you something important." "Good to see you too, James," Mr. Thompson replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip. He turned to Sarah, his expression curious. "And who might this be?" "This is Sarah," James introduced. "We're working on an important project together, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on some things happening around here." Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Is that so? Well, I'm always up for a good conversation." James and Sarah took seats across from him, and James took a deep breath, ready to dive into their discussion. "We're gathering testimonies about Hank's Diner and the treatment of customers, particularly people of color. We believe there's a pattern of discrimination that needs to be addressed." Mr. Thompson's expression shifted, a mixture of concern and understanding crossing his face. "You're right to be concerned. I've seen it myself. Hank has turned away several black customers, claiming they were not the right fit for his diner." Sarah leaned in, her voice earnest. "Would you be willing to share your experience with us? It's important that we document these incidents to challenge Hank's actions." Mr. Thompson considered their request carefully, his gaze flickering to Hank, who was now standing at the counter, chatting with a couple of regulars. "I've seen things, but you have to understand the risk involved. Hank has a lot of influence in this community, and standing up to him can lead to backlash." James felt a surge of determination. "We're prepared to face any challenges that come our way. But your voice matters, Mr. Thompson. We need to show the community that we won't tolerate discrimination." The older man studied them both, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded slowly, a glimmer of resolve in his eyes. "All right, I'll share my story, but we must be careful. I've watched too many good people be silenced over the years." With that, Mr. Thompson recounted his experiences. He spoke of the time he had come in for breakfast and overheard Hank making derogatory comments about a group of black teenagers who had just walked in. He recounted how Hank had turned them away, claiming they were causing a disturbance, despite them simply being loud and jovial in their conversations. As Mr. Thompson spoke, Sarah took diligent notes, and James's heart raced. The man's experiences mirrored what they had feared. This was not an isolated incident. There was a deeper issue at play, one that echoed through the diner's walls. By the time Mr. Thompson finished, James could see the weight of the past pressing down on him, a burden he had carried alone for far too long. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said softly. "Your story is invaluable. We will ensure that it's heard." James felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. "We need to gather more testimonies like yours. Can you help us reach out to others who might be willing to share?" "Of course," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice stronger now. "I know a few folks who have experienced similar situations. If you're committed to this cause, I'll help you however I can." As they exchanged contact information and discussed a plan for reaching out to others, James felt a sense of hope beginning to blossom. They were no longer alone in this fight. They had allies who understood the stakes. After wrapping up their conversation, James and Sarah returned to their booth, energized by their progress. "This is just the beginning," James said, looking at Sarah. "With Mr. Thompson's help, we can build a stronger case against Hank." Sarah smiled, her determination evident. "Absolutely. We should focus on gathering as many testimonies as possible over the next few days. The more evidence we have, the harder it will be for Hank to dismiss our claims." As they discussed their next steps, the bell above the diner door chimed again, and in walked a group of familiar faces, several friends of Mr. Thompson, all of whom had faced discrimination at Hank's establishment. James and Sarah exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. This was the moment they had been waiting for. "Let's approach them," James said, rising from his seat. They walked over to the group, and after a brief introduction, James spoke up. "We're gathering stories about experiences here at Hank's Diner, and we would love to hear your thoughts on what's been happening." One of the men, a middle-aged gentleman named Mr. Lewis, leaned in, his expression serious. "You're not the first to come forward, you know. Hank has turned away countless people, and we've all seen it. I've had enough." As the conversation unfolded, the group began to share their stories, each tale intertwining to form a tapestry of pain, resilience, and determination. James and Sarah listened intently, jotting down notes and recording their testimonies. Each account was a thread woven into the larger narrative of injustice, a collective memory that needed to be brought to light. As they shared their experiences, the atmosphere shifted. The diner was no longer just a place of meals. It became a battleground for dignity and justice. As they wrapped up their discussion, James felt a surge of energy in the room. "Together, we can hold Hank accountable," he declared. "This is not just about food. It's about respect and equality." The group nodded, their resolve solidifying as they agreed to support James and Sarah's mission. Little did they know that Hank was watching from a distance, a storm brewing in his eyes. He had sensed the gathering against him and felt the weight of the collective voices rising. His grip on power had always been unchallenged, but now it seemed like the tide was beginning to shift. As James and Sarah walked out of Hank's Diner that day, they felt invigorated, their hearts beating with a newfound sense of purpose. They had allies, testimonies, and a growing movement to challenge the status quo. But they also knew that they were stepping into dangerous territory. Hank would not take kindly to being confronted, and the fight for justice would come with its own set of challenges. As they parted ways, James couldn't shake the feeling that their actions had set a series of events in motion, events that would not only test their resolve, but also uncover the deep-seated issues that plagued their community. The storm was gathering, and they were right in its path. The pushback. The next few days flew by in a whirlwind of activity. James and Sarah spent every available moment gathering testimonies, interviewing patrons of Hank's Diner, and compiling evidence of the discrimination they had observed. Each conversation unveiled more layers of Hank's bias, revealing a pattern of behavior that extended beyond race and included anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. As they conducted interviews, their efforts began to gain traction. Word spread through the community, and they found themselves at the center of a burgeoning movement for justice. Local activists took notice, and soon support started pouring in. Flyers were distributed, and social media campaigns were launched, calling attention to the discrimination at Hank's Diner. James felt a surge of pride as they met with various advocacy groups, sharing their findings and rallying support. The community was waking up, inspired by the bravery of everyday citizens standing up for their rights. However, beneath the surface of this burgeoning movement, an undercurrent of tension began to rise. One evening, after a long day of interviews, James and Sarah met at a nearby coffee shop to discuss their next steps. The cafe buzzed with conversation, but James felt a strange sense of foreboding. "I think we need to approach this next phase carefully," he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Hank's not going to sit back and let this happen without a fight." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed in concern. "You're right. I can already feel the pressure mounting. I overheard some customers in the diner today talking about how Hank has been getting angrier and more defensive since we started speaking out." James sighed, feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. "We need to prepare for backlash. He's going to retaliate, and we should be ready for anything." Just as they were deep in conversation, the door of the cafe swung open, and a familiar figure entered. Hank. His demeanor was different this time, his eyes blazing with anger. He scanned the room, and when his gaze landed on James and Sarah, he marched over with a determined stride. "What are you two doing here?" Hank snapped, his voice low and threatening. "I thought I made myself clear last time." James felt a rush of adrenaline. "We're discussing the situation at your diner, Hank. We're not backing down." Hank's expression hardened. "You think you can just walk in here and destroy my business? You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into. People like you don't belong in places like mine." Sarah's hands clenched into fists on the table. "This isn't about you or your business. It's about treating everyone with respect, something you clearly fail to understand." "Respect?" Hank scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "I give respect where it's due, and that doesn't include you two. You think you can start a movement against me? I have connections, and I'll make sure this ends badly for both of you." James stood, his towering presence casting a shadow over Hank. "You're not going to intimidate us, Hank. We're not afraid of you or your threats. We're standing up for what's right, and we won't be silenced." Hank leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're making a big mistake, Marshall. I know how to play the game, and I can destroy you if I want to. Remember that." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the cafe, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Sarah looked at James, her expression a mixture of determination and fear. "We need to be cautious. He's not going to let this go." James took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. "I know, but we can't back down now. We're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. If we give in to fear, then we let him win." As they continued to strategize, the sense of urgency grew. They agreed to reach out to more community members and expand their network of supporters. The following day, they planned a rally outside Hank's Diner, inviting everyone who had been affected by Hank's discrimination to come forward and share their stories. The rally day arrived, and excitement filled the air as people gathered in front of the diner, holding signs and banners that proclaimed messages of unity and equality. James and Sarah stood at the forefront, energized by the crowd's passion. Local media outlets arrived, eager to cover the event and amplify the voices of those who had long been silenced. As the rally began, Sarah took the microphone first. "Thank you all for being here today. We're here to stand against discrimination and demand that everyone be treated with respect, regardless of their race or background. It's time to take a stand and hold those who perpetuate injustice accountable." Cheers erupted from the crowd, and James felt a swell of pride as he watched Sarah inspire those around her. The energy was contagious, and as each speaker shared their story, the collective pain transformed into a powerful message of resilience and hope. James stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding as he looked out at the sea of faces. "I've dedicated my life to serving and protecting this community, and what I've seen at Hank's Diner is unacceptable. Discrimination has no place in our city, and together we can bring about change." The crowd roared in agreement, a wave of solidarity washing over them. But as the rally continued, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being washed. He scanned the crowd and caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure lingering at the edge of the gathering. The unease returned, settling in his gut like a stone. After the rally concluded, Sarah and James were flooded with supporters, people eager to share their own experiences and offer their help. The energy was electric, but James couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Hank was plotting his retaliation. "Did you notice that guy over there?" James asked Sarah, nodding discreetly toward the figure he had seen earlier. "I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us." Sarah looked over, her brow furrowing. "Yeah, I saw him too. He didn't seem like someone who belonged here." "Let's be careful," James said, a sense of foreboding creeping in. "Hank won't take this lying down, and if he's hired someone to intimidate us, we need to be prepared." In the days that followed, the movement continued to grow, but the tension between James, Sarah, and Hank escalated. They received a series of threatening messages, anonymously sent notes that warned them to stop their efforts or face dire consequences. Each message was crafted to instill fear, but James and Sarah refused to be deterred. Instead, they used the threats to galvanize their supporters, turning fear into fuel for their fight. Then one night, while James was reviewing the collected testimonies in his apartment, his phone rang. It was Sarah, her voice frantic. "James, I think something's about to happen. I just got a call from Mr. Thompson. Hank is planning something big. He's organizing a counter-protest at the diner." "Are you serious?" James exclaimed, his heart racing. "We have to warn our supporters. This could get ugly." "I'll start spreading the word. We can't let him intimidate us," Sarah replied, her determination evident even through the phone. James hung up, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He quickly gathered his things and headed out to meet Sarah, a sense of urgency propelling him forward. As he made his way to the diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into a storm. Arriving at the diner, the atmosphere was electric. The counter-protest was already underway, with Hank rallying his supporters. People who were either loyal to him or simply ignorant of the deeper issues at play. Banners with derogatory slogans and chants of "Keep Hank's Diner Open" echoed through the streets. James spotted Sarah near the front lines, her expression a mix of fear and determination. He rushed to her side, and together they faced the growing hostility. "This isn't just about Hank's Diner anymore," James said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "This is about standing up to hate in all its forms. We can't let them drown us out." As the counter-protesters shouted, James and Sarah raised their voices, leading the crowd in chants of unity and equality. The contrast between the two sides was stark, but the spirit of the movement felt indomitable. However, as the night wore on, the tension escalated. Hank's supporters grew increasingly aggressive, shouting slurs and attempting to intimidate the peaceful protesters. James felt his heart race as he watched the situation devolve. He knew they needed to maintain control. "Stay strong," he shouted to their supporters, trying to rally them against the growing hostility. "We are here for justice, and we will not back down." Just as things began to spiral, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and a line of police cars pulled up, blue lights flashing. James felt a mix of relief and apprehension. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The presence of law enforcement could help keep the peace. But as the officers stepped out, James's heart sank. Among them was Hank's old friend from the precinct, Officer Thompson, a man known for his leniency toward Hank and his establishment. The sight of him made James realize that this could complicate matters further. "James, Sarah," Officer Thompson called, approaching them with a concerned expression. "What's going on here?" "Hank's supporters are trying to drown out our protest," James explained, gesturing to the chaotic scene. "We're here standing up for equality, but it's turning violent." Officer Thompson looked between the two sides, his brow furrowing. "This is a tough situation. You know Hank has his supporters. I can't promise how things will play out." James's frustration bubbled over. This isn't about Hank's supporters. It's about the right to be treated equally. If Hank's Diner is a place of discrimination, we have to stand against it. The officer shifted uneasily, clearly caught in a difficult position. "I understand, but you need to keep the peace. We don't want this to escalate into violence." Just then, a commotion erupted from Hank's side of the crowd. Voices shouted louder, fists clenched, and the atmosphere thickened with hostility. James knew they had to act quickly before the situation spiraled out of control. "Listen up," he called out to the crowd, his voice steady. "We're not here to fight. We're here to demand respect and equality. We won't let Hank's actions define us or this community." As James spoke, Sarah joined him, holding up a sign that read, "Justice for All." Their rallying cry reverberated through the crowd, drawing the attention of both sides. Slowly, their supporters began to join in, chanting in unison, drowning out the noise of Hank's followers. But just as hope began to swell, Hank's supporters surged forward, breaking through the line of police officers. Chaos erupted as shoving and shouting ensued. James and Sarah stood firm, linking arms with fellow protesters to create a barrier against the advancing crowd. "Stay strong," James shouted, adrenaline surging. "We are united, and we will not be silenced." In that moment, James realized the true depth of their mission. It wasn't just about the diner anymore. It was about standing against years of systemic discrimination and oppression. They were part of something much larger, a movement that would challenge the status quo and strive for equality in all aspects of life. As the night wore on, the chaos continued, but their resolve only strengthened. In the midst of the turmoil, James and Sarah exchanged glances filled with determination. They knew that the fight was far from over, but together, they would face whatever came next. The storm had arrived, and they were ready to stand firm against it. Rising tensions. The sun had long set, casting shadows over the remnants of the protest outside Hank's Diner. Although the rally had ended with police intervention and an uneasy standoff, the underlying tension in Detroit had only intensified. In the days following the protest, James and Sarah found themselves navigating a storm of hostility and support. Hank's counter-protest had garnered attention, and soon, his supporters had begun to push back against their movement, spreading misinformation and attempting to paint James and Sarah as troublemakers rather than advocates for justice. As the dust began to settle, James spent hours reviewing video footage from the rally, hoping to find evidence of Hank's supporters' aggressive behavior. Each clip only served to deepen his frustration. Hank was determined to vilify them, and he had the ear of influential people within the community. Sarah arrived at James's apartment, her expression serious. "I've been doing some digging," she said, sitting down beside him. "There's been a lot of chatter on social media. Hank's trying to sway public opinion, painting us as the antagonists in this situation." James leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "We need to counter that narrative. We have to show people that this isn't just about us. It's about standing up against discrimination and injustice." "I've spoken to several people from the community," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "Many are willing to speak out, but they're afraid of the backlash. Hank has a lot of influence, and people don't want to risk their jobs or reputation. James felt a wave of frustration wash over him. That's exactly what Hank is banking on. Fear. We need to empower people to stand up for what's right, not just for themselves, but for the greater good. If they see that we're not backing down, maybe they'll find the courage to join us. Maybe we can organize another event, Sarah suggested, her eyes lighting up. Something that focuses on community solidarity. If we can unite enough voices, it might shift the tide. I like that idea, James agreed, feeling invigorated. A community meeting where we can discuss the importance of equality and share personal stories. If we create a safe space for people to express themselves, it could inspire others to speak out against Hank's discrimination. They quickly began to brainstorm ideas for the event, deciding to host it at a community center that was well known and accessible to everyone. They envisioned a panel discussion featuring community leaders, advocates, and individuals who had been affected by discrimination. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, reaching out to local organizations, setting up a social media campaign, and inviting anyone willing to share their story. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with people rallying around the idea of coming together to promote solidarity and unity. But Hank was not idle. As the day of the community meeting approached, he intensified his efforts to undermine James and Sarah's movement. He reached out to local news outlets, attempting to spin the narrative in his favor, accusing James of trying to incite chaos and division in the community. His influence loomed large, and he began to threaten those who were supporting James and Sarah, hinting at potential consequences if they chose to participate in the meeting. James and Sarah were aware of the backlash they were facing, but their resolve remained unshakable. On the day of the meeting, the community center buzzed with anticipation. The atmosphere was charged with energy as attendees arrived, eager to share their experiences and engage in meaningful discussions. As the event commenced, James stood at the front, looking out over the diverse crowd. People of different ages, backgrounds, and ethnicities filled the seats, their expressions a mix of hope and determination. Sarah joined him on stage, her face radiant with enthusiasm. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice carrying through the room. "We're here today to stand united against discrimination and to create a space where our voices can be heard. This is a safe haven where we can share our stories and learn from one another." Applause erupted, and James felt a swell of pride. The crowd was responding positively, but a nagging sense of unease tugged at him. He had no doubt that Hank was watching, possibly plotting how to undermine their efforts once again. The panel discussion began, featuring speakers who bravely shared their experiences of discrimination. Some had faced it in Hank's diner, while others had encountered it in various aspects of their lives. Each story echoed the themes of resilience, courage, and the unwavering fight for justice. As the stories unfolded, James noticed the energy in the room shift. People began to nod in agreement, some even wiping away tears. The shared experiences resonated deeply, creating a sense of solidarity among the attendees. Then, during a break, James spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was Mr. Thompson, the retired teacher who had shared his story during the previous protests. James approached him, grateful for his presence. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Thompson. Your support means a lot to us." "I wouldn't miss it," he replied, his voice steady. "This is too important. We need to stand together now more than ever." As the event resumed, Sarah facilitated a Q and a session, inviting audience members to ask questions and share their thoughts. A young woman stood up, her hands trembling slightly. "I've been scared to speak out. Hank has made it clear that anyone who stands against him will face consequences. How can we fight back?" James felt a surge of determination. "That's precisely why we're here. Hank may have his influence, but we have each other. The more we stand together, the stronger we become. It's about creating a community where we uplift one another and refuse to let fear control us." The crowd erupted in applause, the energy palpable. James could feel the collective strength growing within the room. It was as if the very essence of their fight had ignited a fire in everyone's hearts. As the meeting continued, a young man stood up and shared his story of discrimination he had faced while working a part-time job. "I've always felt like I had to keep my head down just to keep my job. But hearing all of you speak, I realize I'm not alone. It's time to make a stand." With each story shared, the bond between the attendees deepened. James and Sarah exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement of the impact they were making. As the evening progressed, however, the atmosphere shifted. Outside the community center, the sound of revving engines filled the air, and a group of Hank's supporters began to gather. Their chants and taunts crept into the meeting, attempting to disrupt the positive energy inside. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "We need to stay calm," he whispered to Sarah. "We can't let them provoke us." But the noise grew louder, and soon, a couple of Hank's supporters stormed into the center, faces twisted in anger. "You don't belong here," one of them shouted, pointing at James and Sarah. "Hank is right. This is a place for real people, not you troublemakers." The crowd erupted into chaos, and James stepped forward, raising his hands to calm everyone. "Everyone, please, let's not let them ruin what we're trying to accomplish here." But the situation quickly escalated. Hank's supporters shouted insults, and as tensions rose, it became clear that they were there to intimidate, to shut down the movement before it gained any more momentum. "Get out of here," another voice shouted, and the crowd began to shift uneasily. Some attendees looked to James and Sarah for guidance, while others felt the weight of fear creeping in. "Stay strong. We're not going anywhere," Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We're here to stand against hate, and we won't be silenced." With her words, a rallying cry echoed through the community center, and attendees began to chant in solidarity. "We stand together. We stand together." The counter-protesters were momentarily taken aback, but they quickly regrouped and pushed further into the room, determined to provoke a reaction. James felt a surge of anger and frustration rise within him. "Enough is enough," he bellowed, his voice booming through the chaos. "This is a space for peace and unity. You're welcome to leave if you can't respect that." The tension in the air was electric as James squared his shoulders, refusing to back down. He could see Hank's supporters were hesitating, caught between their anger and the power of the crowd surrounding them. Suddenly, one of Hank's supporters threw a drink across the room, splattering it onto the panel's table. The liquid landed on Sarah's shirt, and for a brief moment, everyone froze. The shock of the moment hung heavy in the air. James stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't how we resolve our differences. We're here to create dialogue, not chaos. If you want to engage in meaningful conversation, we welcome that, but we won't tolerate violence." As the atmosphere crackled with tension, a police officer stepped into the room, taking in the scene. He glanced at Hank's supporters, who were now retreating slightly, and then turned to James and Sarah. "What's going on here?" James seized the opportunity. "We're hosting a community meeting to discuss discrimination and equality. Unfortunately, some individuals have come to disrupt our efforts." The officer nodded, taking a step closer. "We need to keep the peace. I suggest you address the crowd. Let them know that violence won't solve anything." James took a deep breath, sensing the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Everyone, listen up," he called, raising his hands. "We are here for a purpose, to stand united against discrimination. We won't let anger and hatred divide us. We are a community, and together, we can foster change." The crowd responded, their voices merging into a harmonious chorus. "United for change. United for change." With the chants echoing in the room, Hank's supporters began to back away, visibly shaken by the resilience of the crowd. James could see that their intimidation tactics were failing, and it fueled his determination. "Let's take this moment to remind ourselves why we're here," James continued, his voice steady. "We're not here to fight. We're here to foster understanding and create a better future for everyone. Let's show them what unity looks like." As the chant swelled, Hank's supporters retreated further, realizing they were outnumbered by a community that refused to be silenced. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew the battle was far from over. As the crowd began to calm, Sarah turned to James, her eyes filled with pride and determination. "We did it, James. We stood our ground." James nodded, feeling the adrenaline fade, but the resolve strengthened within him. "This is just the beginning. We've shown that we won't be intimidated, but we need to stay vigilant. Hank won't give up easily." As the evening came to a close, attendees began to disperse, but the sense of community remained strong. People lingered, sharing their thoughts and making connections with one another. James and Sarah took a moment to breathe, the weight of the night slowly lifting. "I think we've turned a corner tonight," Sarah said, her voice filled with optimism. "We've shown that we can stand up against hate and support one another in the face of adversity." James smiled, feeling a sense of camaraderie in the air. "Absolutely. We just need to keep this momentum going. We can't let Hank or anyone else take that away from us." As they walked out of the community center together, the night air felt different. It was charged with possibility, a testament to the strength of their community and the determination to create a better future. But deep down, James knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Hank was still out there, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. With resolve etched into their hearts, James and Sarah were ready to face whatever lay ahead, united in their pursuit of justice and equality. The battle for their community had just begun, but together they were prepared to weather any storm. The path forward. The following weeks unfolded with a mixture of hope and tension in Detroit. The community meeting had sparked a wave of activism, and James and Sarah found themselves at the forefront of a movement that was gaining momentum. They had become symbols of resilience, their story drawing attention from local media outlets and advocacy groups. As support for their cause grew, so did the backlash from Hank and his followers. Hank, feeling cornered and threatened, began ramping up his campaign against them. He launched a series of online attacks, spreading misinformation and attempting to tarnish their reputations. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags trending in both support and opposition. In the midst of this chaos, James and Sarah remained resolute. They spent their days organizing more events, conducting interviews, and gathering testimonies from individuals who had experienced discrimination at Hank's Diner and beyond. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. People were eager to share their stories, and new voices were joining the movement every day. One afternoon, as they were preparing for a new rally, Sarah came rushing into James's apartment, a stack of papers clutched tightly in her hands. "James, you won't believe what I just found." He looked up, intrigued. "What's going on?" Sarah laid the papers on the table, her eyes wide with excitement. "I spoke to some former employees of Hank's Diner. They've come forward with accounts of the toxic environment Hank created, not just for customers, but for staff as well. This is gold." James leaned closer, scanning the pages. These testimonies could be the missing pieces we need to show the systemic issues at play. If we can reveal how Hank treats his employees, it will only strengthen our case. "Exactly," Sarah exclaimed, a smile breaking across her face. "They're willing to go on record, and some are even ready to speak at the next rally. This could change everything." James felt a surge of hope. "Let's reach out to them and set up a time to meet. We need to ensure they feel safe and supported. Hank's not going to take this lying down. We have to protect them." As they began to plan their next steps, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were inching closer to a significant turning point. They organized a rally for the following weekend, focusing on the theme of Voices of the Unheard, highlighting the stories of those who had been marginalized. On the day of the rally, the air was electric with anticipation. People gathered outside the community center, holding signs and banners that display powerful messages of solidarity. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of purpose as the crowd grew larger, uniting under a common cause. As the event kicked off, James stepped up to the microphone, his heart racing. "Thank you all for being here today. Today, we stand together not just for ourselves, but for those who have been silenced for far too long. We're here to demand justice and to shine a light on the discrimination that has plagued our community." The crowd erupted in cheers, and James felt the energy swell around him. He introduced the first speaker, a former waitress from Hank's diner named Lisa, who had bravely agreed to share her experiences. Lisa approached the microphone, her hands shaking slightly but her voice steady. "I worked at Hank's diner for over a year. During that time, I witnessed Hank treat customers of color with disdain. I saw him turn away families simply because of the color of their skin. And when I spoke up about it, I was threatened with my job. I had to leave because I refused to be part of an establishment that perpetuated hate." As she spoke, the crowd listened intently, nodding in agreement and murmuring support. Lisa's bravery resonated deeply, and James felt a swell of pride for everyone who had gathered to support one another. The rally continued with several other speakers sharing their experiences, each story adding to the tapestry of injustice that Hank had woven. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, and by the end of the rally, the crowd was united in their commitment to continue the fight against discrimination. But just as James and Sarah began to celebrate their success, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. Hank himself, flanked by a group of his supporters. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach as Hank marched forward, his face set in a scowl. "What are you doing here, Hank?" James called out, trying to maintain control of the situation. Hank stepped forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm here to put an end to this nonsense. You think you can just smear my name and ruin my business. This is my livelihood." "Your livelihood is built on discrimination," James retorted, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "People deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of their race." Hank scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Respect? You think you're some kind of hero. You're nothing but a troublemaker trying to incite chaos. You're ruining this community." The crowd shifted uneasily, tension palpable in the air. "This isn't about ruining the community," Sarah interjected, her voice strong. "It's about standing up against hate and injustice. We won't let you intimidate us anymore." Hank's face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this. I'll make sure everyone knows you're the real villains here. This isn't over." With that, he turned and stormed away, his supporters trailing behind him. James felt a mix of anger and determination rise within him. Hank's threats only fueled their resolve to fight back against the discrimination that had taken root in their community. As the rally concluded, James and Sarah gathered their supporters, discussing their next steps. "We can't let Hank intimidate us," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "We need to keep the momentum going. We have people willing to share their stories, and we need to amplify their voices." James nodded in agreement. "Let's plan for another event soon. We can also reach out to local news stations and ensure they cover the impact of Hank's actions. If we can keep this in the public eye, we can hold him accountable." As they began to organize their plans, they could feel the weight of the challenges ahead. Hank was not going to back down easily, and James knew that the fight for justice would require unwavering dedication. The following days were filled with interviews, meetings, and discussions with community leaders. They coordinated with local activists, strategizing ways to keep their message alive and to ensure that the stories of those affected by discrimination were heard far and wide. However, the tension in the community continued to simmer beneath the surface. Hank's supporters were growing bolder, and they began to resort to more aggressive tactics to silence James and Sarah. They started vandalizing properties with messages of hate, targeting homes and businesses that were supportive of the movement. One evening, as James and Sarah were reviewing plans for the upcoming event at his apartment, they heard a loud crash outside. James rushed to the window, peering out to see a group of Hank's supporters vandalizing a nearby storefront that had displayed a sign in support of their movement. "Not again," James muttered, frustration boiling within him. "We can't let this go unchecked. We need to document this," Sarah said, already pulling out her phone to capture the moment. "We can't let them intimidate us into silence. This is proof of their aggression." James nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Let's call the police. We have to make sure they know what's happening." As Sarah dialed the police, James stepped outside, determination fueling his actions. "Hey," he shouted, approaching the group. "What do you think you're doing?" The group turned, their expressions filled with defiance. "We're sending a message," one of them yelled back. "You and your little movement are not welcome here." "This is our community too," James responded, standing tall. "You can't silence us with hate. We're fighting for what's right." Tension crackled in the air as the opposing sides faced off. Just then, the sound of sirens approached, and the police arrived on the scene, lights flashing. "Step back," one of the officers shouted, trying to establish control. "What's going on here?" James stepped forward, pointing to the vandalism. "They're vandalizing this business because of its support for our movement. We need to hold them accountable for their actions." As the officer took notes and began to assess the situation, James could feel the weight of the moment. They were not just standing up for a single store, they were defending their right to exist as a community, to express their values without fear of retribution. Despite the chaos, James remained resolute. "This is just the beginning," he declared to the crowd. "We will not back down. We will continue to stand united, no matter what tactics Hank and his supporters use to intimidate us." The police began to disperse the crowd, advising Hank's supporters to leave the area. As tension slowly eased, James felt a surge of determination within him. They were not just fighting for their own dignity, they were fighting for the future of their community. The next day, they gathered with community leaders and supporters to strategize their response. "We need to keep the pressure on Hank and make sure his actions have consequences," Sarah said, her voice filled with resolve. "We can't let him think he can bully us into silence." James nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. What if we organized a series of peaceful demonstrations outside Hank's diner? We could invite everyone who has been affected by discrimination to share their stories and express their support. "That's a brilliant idea," Sarah exclaimed. "We can turn the focus back onto the issue at hand and show Hank that our movement is stronger than his attempts to silence us." As they planned the demonstrations, the sense of unity among the community grew stronger. People from all walks of life joined their cause, determined to stand against the discrimination that had plagued their neighborhood for too long. With each passing day, James felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They were not just fighting for justice, they were igniting a movement that would challenge deep-rooted systemic issues in their community. As the day of the first demonstration approached, excitement and apprehension mingled in the air. James and Sarah had gathered an incredible turnout, and the community was ready to stand up against the hate that had taken hold. On the day of the demonstration, they arrived at Hank's diner, the atmosphere charged with energy. People gathered with signs that read "Unity over hate" and "Everyone deserves respect." As they stood in solidarity, James felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This was it, the moment they had fought for, the culmination of their efforts to challenge the discrimination that had long plagued their community. As they prepared to begin, James stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "Thank you all for being here today. We are not here to incite anger. We are here to demand justice. We are here to show that our community stands united against discrimination and hatred." Cheers erupted from the crowd, a chorus of voices echoing their shared determination. As speakers took turns sharing their stories, James felt an overwhelming sense of pride and purpose. They were not just speaking out against Hank. They were standing up for everyone who had been marginalized and silenced. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that Hank would not simply accept defeat. As the day wore on, James remained vigilant, acutely aware that the fight was far from over. As the demonstration continued, he caught sight of a familiar face among the crowd. Officer Thompson, the police officer who had been present during the previous tensions. This time, however, he appeared different, his expression contemplative as he listened to the stories being shared. James approached him, sensing an opportunity. "Officer Thompson," he said, his voice steady, "thank you for being here. It's important for the community to see that not everyone in law enforcement supports Hank's actions." The officer looked down, his shoulders heavy. "I've seen too many people hurt by this situation. I didn't realize how deep the issues ran until now. I want to help." James felt a flicker of hope. "Your voice matters. If you stand with us, it could change the narrative in the community. We need allies who are willing to stand up against discrimination." "I'm in," Officer Thompson replied, determination evident in his voice. "Let's work together to make a difference." As they rejoined the crowd, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Officer Thompson on their side, they could amplify their message and challenge the status quo. As the day drew to a close, the crowd began to disperse, but the impact of the demonstration lingered in the air. James and Sarah exchanged glances, their hearts filled with determination. The fight for justice was far from over, but they had shown the community that they would not be silenced. Together, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their pursuit of equality and justice for all. As the sun set over Detroit, casting a golden hue over the city, James felt a sense of hope. They were on the cusp of something transformative, a movement that could change lives and reshape their community for the better. With renewed strength, James and Sarah were prepared to weather the storm, knowing that the path forward would require courage, resilience, and unwavering unity. Together, they would rise against the tides of discrimination and hatred, illuminating the way for a brighter future.